There we are. So, Fernanda, and welcome to this afternoon's workshop on the principles of planning. For those of you who do not know me already, my name is Dave Edwards, and I'll be presenting today's session with Kerry Williams. Now, this session follows on from the two previous workshops on curriculum design and assessment. Those included the sessions about schools agreeing upon their vision and their values. During this session, Kerry and I intend to build upon those workshops by sharing some useful advice and tips on the process of planning that you can use back at school with colleagues to put your school's vision, values and behaviours into practice. As you know, Kerry and I work closely with primary schools, and we both appreciate that schools are at very different stages of the curriculum design and planning processes at the moment. Now, this session may act as a starting point for some schools, but we're also very much aware that most of you have already started to change your planning. As schools are becoming more familiar with the principles of planning for Curriculum for Wales, they're becoming more confident at weaving in the various elements of planning. But for this session, during the trialling stage, the general consensus is that we're going to keep things simple. We're going to try and keep things as straightforward as possible, keeping to the key principles. And I'm sure many of you, you'll be in a position to say, yeah, we're doing that already. So it will confirm to you that you are at the moment following effective processes. But I'm sure between all the contributions from the schools, we'll all be taking something away which is useful from this particular session. Just as schools are encouraged to take ownership of their curriculum, they also now have ownership of their planning processes as well. So we aim to offer guidance and direction, but we're going to avoid being overly prescriptive. And this is so that each school can develop planning processes that suit them best. We aim to raise awareness of the key considerations for the planning process, but we don't want to provide ready-made, off-the-peg planning documents. Now, initially, schools were asking to be shown examples of how planning should look. There is now an understanding that an individual school's curriculum and an individual school planning is going to be very much bespoke to them. And Kerry and I are conscious that there's a lot of information in a short time this afternoon. So what we've done is we've uploaded this PowerPoint, so you don't need to make loads of notes after this session. And we've also got examples of planning from primary schools as well, primary schools in our area, that you can refer to after this session when you've got time to reflect on your own practice. And the PowerPoint will include links to the relevant Welsh Government documents as well. We've done this to save you time searching for them later. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that to begin with, we'll look at the main objectives of this particular session. Now, the first objective is to help develop understanding of the principles of planning for learning within the Curriculum for Wales. And we'll also look at the principles of assessment and progression again within the planning process. We are aiming this afternoon to raise awareness of the key considerations that could underpin your choices and strengthen understanding of the curriculum guidance and how all of the elements are interconnected. Hopefully, we'll be guiding you to make those connections between whole school curriculum design and the planning across all of the AOLEs. Now, although I've just said it's not our intention to offer off-the-peg documents to take away, Kerry and I feel it's going to be useful for you to see real-life examples from schools to demonstrate a range of planning approaches. So during this session, we'll have time to share a couple of examples from schools in the Gwere region who very kindly agreed to share with you their planning processes. Planning overviews from two other schools in the region have also been uploaded for you to take a look at following on from this afternoon. So that's the plan for this session, and I'm now going to hand you over to Kerry.
Okay. The national vision is to develop a strong, inclusive schools that are committed to excellence, equity and well-being. The reforms are set in the context that every child should be taught in a school that sets high expectations for all learners and teachers. Welsh Government have previously facilitated professional learning to go alongside the rollout, such as the vision building and the change management sessions, which have already been delivered but are available on the GWER website. School leaders will facilitate the rollout by developing a culture for change, for putting time and effort into developing understanding of the new curriculum and the assessment framework across the school. They will ensure that the school development plan sets out the priorities to realise a new curriculum for the school and ensure that there's meaningful collaboration and shared commitment across the 3 to 16 continuum. The starting point of the journey to rollout for many schools has been to raise awareness of the understanding of the rationale for change. This has involved schools researching and becoming familiar with the relevant documentation, and there is a wealth of information and guidance available. Everything is there already, but it takes time to research, read, digest and contextualise things to your school. As we know, time is a very precious commodity in schools, and certainly schools' capacity to engage with all of the documentation has been really limited during recent events. This time is crucial, though, to really understand the documentation and how everything fits together. The more familiar the guidance becomes, the more things will start to make sense and the clearer the connections will become. Schools need to ensure that deepening understanding of the 4 purposes, what they mean for their learners, how to use this information to guide their curriculum realisation and align this with their approach to assessment and pedagogy. The Successful Futures document had outlined recommendations for education in Wales, and this has been realised in the new curriculum. It identified that every school will need to develop its own curriculum because it is the individual schools who know their pupils and their local setting best. The Curriculum for Wales guidance provides clear statements about what is important in delivering a broad and balanced education, noting that nothing is so essential as universal access to and acquisition of the experiences, knowledge and skills that our young people need for employment, lifelong learning and active citizenship. The Journey to Rollout document clearly shows the steps that schools need to take in order to be ready for first teaching in September 2022. This will be a start of a process of refining, improving and adapting, and it will take time for schools to be really find out what works for them and their learners. The link at the bottom of the screen will take you to the Curriculum for Wales Journey to Rollout document, but some of the key messages that are included within this document refer to how high quality teaching and learning underpins the curriculum. It notes that practitioners need to have that time and space to develop their teaching, and they should provide learners with a wide range of learning experiences that are supported by effective and varied use of pedagogy. These may be refined to reflect inquiry-based approaches, and these holistic experiences should relate to the purpose of learning and support learners' progression, and practitioners should have increasing ownership over what and how they teach. It's also vital during the reform process to ensure the well-being of staff and learners. The journey to rollout should involve development through co-construction, equity in co-construction, space and time to think, a clear understanding of why things are learned and done, critical engagement with expertise and research, leadership at all levels, and schools should be operating as learning organisations. We'll explore all of these in a little bit more depth throughout the course today. As Dave said, we can't advocate a particular approach to planning, as one size definitely does not fit all. Each school will need to trial and align what they do to their own vision and values. Go to the next slide, please. We appreciate that planning within a new curriculum with so many different elements to consider can feel very burdensome. New processes, unfamiliar jargon, and seemingly endless documentation to plough through can at times feel overwhelming. And finding the time to read and digest all of the information has not been easy during very challenging times. We know from past reforms, such as the introduction of the foundation phase, that it can be difficult to get to grips with everything. And initially, staff may need to constantly refer to documentation to become familiar with the new terminology and the elements involved. Over time, as people start to trial and implement different approaches, planning should become more meaningful and manageable. The pieces will start to fit together more naturally. To aid the familiarisation process, we've developed this simple page. It's designed just to be an aid memoir to quickly remind you of the various elements to be considered. More detailed guidance on selecting knowledge, skills and experiences are set out within the Curriculum for Wales guidance, in particular in the Designing Your Curriculum section, but this provides a useful overview. Knowledge, skills and experiences are captured through the planning process and should contribute to learners being able to realise the 4 purposes, which is the whole ambition of the Curriculum for Wales. You can see the 4 purposes are central on the page, but it also covers the other aspects such as the statements of what matters, assessment and progression, and the mandatory elements. This one-page overview provides a quick reference point for all the aspects that need to be considered when planning, but it's important to remember that there's no requirement to include all of these elements in your planning documents. It's very much up to you as a school to decide on what to include, what is important for you as a school, and what's important for your learners. At the beginning, some schools may wish to include all of the elements as a reminder. Then as time passes, as planning becomes more embedded, some schools may decide that they no longer need to refer to all of the elements all of the time. Some elements may be referred to in your higher level curriculum rationale and not routinely appear on short-term planning. For example, schools may highlight in their curriculum rationale that pupils will routinely develop integral skills across the curriculum and therefore decide not to routinely refer to them in weekly plans. On the next slide, we think about how schools have reflected on their vision for their curriculum during the design stage. Schools now have an opportunity to consider and clarify the purpose for their planning. For many teachers, planning is a familiar aspect of their role and one they feel quite confident in doing. It's a teacher's bread and butter. Because of this, many schools have chosen to focus on the planning already, and some schools may have been trialling different planning approaches for some time. Others may just be starting to look at this aspect, or even revisiting their approach to see how well it aligns with their curriculum vision. Whatever stage you are at, hopefully there are some key considerations here that you can bear in mind. These questions on the screen are examples of the types of questions that schools who've been through that process have used to focus their discussions around planning. Who are we planning for? Is it purposeful? Are we building on prior learning and planning for progression? Does our planning align with the purposes and the principles set out in the assessment and progression guidelines? There is a link on here to the GWER assessment support, which is on the GWER website, which will provide some additional guidance if you weren't able to go to that workshop. How do we build in sufficient flexibility, and how can planning be responsive to the learners and their contexts? Have we built in opportunities for co-construction? Collaboration and co-construction will allow schools to share successes, to build and to take on board other views, to develop shared understanding, but it will also enable schools to work together to tackle any problems that they've encountered and jointly develop solutions. How will we evaluate and review the impact of our planning? What's working well? Are there things that we need to change? The second link on the slide, named Key Principles, will take you to that section in the Journey to Curriculum rollout documents, where there's further guidance that may help shape those conversations. Schools who've been developing planning already have been sharing their learning, and we will see some examples of that process a little bit later on. Some of the things that they have discussed as part of the process have been, what are our non-negotiables in our planning? What do we think is essential for our learners in our school? And what don't we want to leave to chance? Do we have an agreed approach? Will planning look the same in all subjects? Do we have a clear shared understanding of what we mean by effective teaching and learning? What are the skills, knowledge and experiences that we want our learners to have? How does the planning help learners to realise the 4 purposes? Which learning will help them contribute better to their communities? And how do we plan for this learning to be across our, to work across our school and across the 3 to 16 curriculum? Is the learning sequential? How will we know if our learners have shown progress in this skill? And how can we communicate the why behind our choice of context and pedagogy? By asking these types of questions during staff meetings or during professional learning activities, schools are able to gain clarity around the purpose for planning at their school and have an agreed approach as a staff. Again, these may look very different in every school. Having highly detailed planning sheets can feel reassuring to some schools. It proves and demonstrates that they've carefully considered what they intend to teach. But until they've been through that process and had those discussions and trialed some of these approaches, it can be difficult to know which aspects of the planning are most useful and why. Who will we planning for? Are we planning because it's useful and purposeful and impacts on learning, or simply to be compliant and to prove coverage? Another consideration for schools is the need to be mindful of staff workload and well-being. We don't want staff to feel overwhelmed with the planning documents that demonstrate compliance, but don't necessarily meet the needs of the learners. Just as the curriculum will be bespoke in each school, the format of planning will also look very individual. For example, long-term planning, such as mapping out topics over a number of years, may feel too restrictive or lack flexibility for some schools, but for others, they may feel that that's a way to ensure that there's balance and breadth in the knowledge, skills, and experiences the learners are having. Some schools may feel that highly detailed planning enables them to know what the planning prevents the effective use of pupil voice during units of work. But for others, that highly detailed planning can feel reassuring as they become more familiar with the content of the new curriculum and how it links together. It's important to remember that it's not the format of the documentation that's most important. It's the process of planning that teachers go through and the use they make of that planning that is key. Does it have an impact, and does it move learning on? Schools are still at the trialling stage, and each school will be able to refine and agree upon a format that suits their school best. We will see some examples of how different schools have approached this later on in the session.
The curriculum reforms require us to consider why we teach, what we teach, and how we teach. And the why is the shared vision, the aspirations for learners in our schools. And it's the school's vision and rationale for their curriculum. The why can also be the response to learners' needs, a response to assessments or identified learning needs. And during the curriculum design stage, schools will have identified already what their pupils should learn about at their school, the values that they want to promote, and the types of experiences that pupils should have. Now, schools now have the freedom and the flexibility to decide on what's best for their learners. And many schools have already taken the important step of consulting with their stakeholders, identifying and agreeing upon a clear rationale for why they're teaching the topics and the concepts that they intend to teach. This session on planning is about the process of putting these previously agreed values and the vision into practice. So it brings us to the what. And the what is the specific knowledge, the skills, the experiences that a school chooses in order that the learners can make progress in the statements of what matters. When choosing what to teach, teachers need to have knowledge and understanding of all the elements of the curriculum guidance. This is where it can be overwhelming at first while you're getting used to all of that documentation. But that knowledge and understanding will increase, and you'll gradually develop a deeper understanding of how they all fit together to bring about learning. And the how is the pedagogy and the planning for learning, deciding on the best teaching approaches to maximize learning and using assessment before, during, and after learning to ensure that learners are making progress. So if we think about the pedagogical principles, they're not a tick list. You don't have to cover all pedagogical principles and tick them off to say they've been done. The pedagogical principles are there as approaches that you can choose according to the learning that's taking place. So you're selecting the most appropriate pedagogy for what you're teaching. Now, although a bit overwhelming at first glance, when planning the delivery of their curriculum, teachers have realised that they're already familiar with many of the key messages, because those key messages are based around effective teaching. For example, maintaining the focus on the 4 purposes, which is basically developing kind, considerate, conscientious citizens of the future and so on. It's what schools have been doing for some time. And effective teaching supports social and emotional development and positive relationships. So really, there's nothing new there, but it's getting to use the terminology. And what schools have been doing is developing pupils' awareness of the contents of the 4 purposes. It's about having high expectations and about using a broad range of teaching approaches, accessing the 12 pedagogical principles. It's about promoting problem solving, creative and critical thinking, and effective teaching builds on learners' previous knowledge and experience. And it's meaningful to pupils and includes authentic context. These things have been done by many schools for many years. The use of assessment for learning is already well established across the region. And so is the promotion of pupil voice, the use of pupil voice and independent learning, with pupils having increasing ownership now of their own learning. And because these elements felt familiar, it has been tempting for some schools to kickstart the planning process by jumping straight in at the deep end and planning new topics and planning new learning experiences without first discussing the school's vision and values. Now, for many schools, the planning of the new curriculum felt like the most familiar aspect, and many schools did start with this area first, and they started trying different approaches. However, as schools go through the process of curriculum design, and as they start to develop a clear vision and a clear rationale for learning in the school, their planning may need to be revisited. For other schools, work up to now has been very much focused on the vision and the values, and they are now at the point where the next step will be to look at the planning. It is very important that every school goes through the curriculum design stage so that everyone involved at the school has a clear understanding and a clear rationale for why they are teaching their chosen curriculum. And by this, we mean that the school's already agreed upon a shared vision for the curriculum, and they are clear about the school's values and the non-negotiables. And by non-negotiables, we're talking about the things you won't leave to chance. So when we hear people talking about pupil voice and pupils deciding which way the curriculum goes and losing that sense of control over what's being taught, actually, all schools need to have their non-negotiables, those things that they will not be leaving to chance. And as you know, the national curriculum used to be a top-down model. A top-down model whereby all schools were required to deliver an intended curriculum with a predetermined range of knowledge and skills. But with the introduction of the curriculum for Wales, the curriculum now will be purpose-driven and individually designed by each school. Schools now have been given permission to weave their individual values, their vision, and the local context into their own curriculum. And this is intentional to make it more relevant and more meaningful to the pupils. So schools are now putting their vision into practice through carefully considered learning experiences and choosing teaching methods that they think are best for their learners. So teachers now have this opportunity, greater freedom and flexibility to influence the daily learning experiences, deciding upon what is taught and how it is taught. And this is a taste of freedom, but it can also cause anxiety as well, because we're going into the unknown. And as well as knowing what to teach, teachers should also have a clear rationale for why they are teaching it and the teaching methods they use. But without going through the curriculum design process, some schools have been tempted to use existing topics and to tick off statements of what matters and to tick off ALLEs that these topics just happen to touch upon. And by doing this, they may have missed out on some of the opportunities given to us through the Curriculum for Wales. Because schools now have the opportunity to keep the things that work well and that align with their school vision. They have the opportunity to adapt things that may need tweaking to align with their vision, and that opportunity as well to get rid of things which are not purposeful and do not support pupil learning. Now on the screen, excuse me, you'll see a diagram indicating the why, the what, and the how. And everyone in your school will be clear about the why they are teaching the topics, and they'll be clear about what they are teaching and clear about how it is going to be taught. And during the curriculum design stage, the school is focusing on the outer circle, why they're going to teach certain things. The examples here include whole school priorities, pupil voice, news items or local issues, the 4 purposes, assessment findings, individual pupil needs, perhaps community projects and school values. All of these considerations drive the vision and the rationale for your curriculum at your school. And reference to the 4 purposes is shown here in the outer ring, but actually they permeate each section. So what do schools need to do now to consider the what and the how? Well, assuming that the curriculum design stage has been completed, and assuming that colleagues are quite clear about the why, they can now start considering and planning learning experiences, what they will be teaching and how that teaching will be carried out. And it's at this stage when schools consider the planning of all the elements of the curriculum guidance and how they interconnect and fit together to bring about learning. And as you can see in the middle circle, these include the integral skills, progression steps, descriptions of learning, cross-curricular skills, and so on. Throughout the planning process, teachers are considering the most appropriate teaching approaches and also, importantly, the use of assessment as well. Now, initially, all of these elements do feel overwhelming for teachers, but we've also found that planning what to teach can be broken down into smaller, more manageable steps. So if we move on to the next slide, planning will look different in each school. And schools have the freedom to choose the content and the duration of their topics. Some units of work, they'll be planned for the whole term. Some will last just for a week or so. Some units of work will be even less. Some topics are very year group specific, while other topics are for whole departments or even across the whole school. Some topics are AOLE specific, while others are integrated. It's entirely up to the school to decide what works best for them. And it could be a combination of all those things. Now, many schools have been using an inquiry approach as their starting point. For example, what if? So some schools have developed topic banks and a selection of big questions or big statements that teachers can select as a driver for a topic. In other schools, a range of topic headings have been agreed upon for the year. Other examples include WOW days. Whatever the system a school has decided to use, teachers tend to have an agreed starting point for each topic or unit of work. A big question or big statement could be the hook at the beginning of the topic, a hook that gets children fully engaged in the topic right from the start. And this hook continues to be the main focus that the teachers will keep referring back to during the unit of work. Now, to help bring together what Kerry and I have talked about so far, we're now going to share with you a clip from St Asaph VP, which demonstrates the approaches they've been taking to planning for the Curriculum for Wales.
At St Asaph VP Infants, we've set off on our curriculum design journey, and I'll briefly share what this has looked like for us. All staff at our school know our why inside out. This is because our curriculum rationale is based on our local context. In a staff meeting, as a team, we worked through the activity you can see on screen now, and this task helped us to identify what our children needed from their curriculum. Some of our unique identity is static, for example, the fact that we're a foundation phase school, but other elements are dynamic, and we recognise that discussions around these areas need to be reviewed annually to ensure that our curriculum remains relevant to our children. We also worked with our children to find out what was important to them so we could support them to develop their values through the curriculum. This work has informed our overall curriculum design along with the 4 purposes. Understanding the statements of what matters and interpreting what they would look like in our school was an essential task. I have to emphasise how fundamental it was that this was carried out before planning for learning. So we used staff meetings again to work through the statements of what matters and identified what we think the fundamental concepts are. So you can see these are highlighted in bold on the left page here, and the example I'm using is from our long-term expressive arts plan. So this activity has enabled my staff to feel more confident and equipped to plan for the new curriculum. It has been a conscious decision to include the statements of what matters in our long-term planning documents. And after developing our understanding of the statements of what matters, we have created our statement of intent for expressive arts. As outlined in the Expressive Arts Guidance on Hub, we wanted to provide the children with equitable opportunities to explore the 5 disciplines of art, dance, drama, film and digital media, and music, and we've therefore included these as vehicles on our expressive arts roadmap. This also forms part of our long-term planning. Our staff worked as a team to map opportunities to develop the 5 disciplines from nursery until the end of year 2. This looks different on each roadmap depending on the area of learning experience. Creating roadmaps which plot subject-specific disciplines or components has ensured our children experienced a balanced and progressive curriculum at the VP. We've also invested a lot of energy reviewing how we will deliver the curriculum, and we feel it's particularly important to plan for experiences as well as knowledge and skills. So we've included experiences as part of our medium-term plans. On screen, you can see our Expressive Arts medium-term plan template, and it includes experiences such as a theatre visit, famous and local artists, exhibitions and Welsh culture, and we believe that these experiences will enable our curriculum to be purposeful and authentic. So we also included discipline-specific considerations, and these are taken from the new curriculum guidance on Hub, and we also chose to include the new cross-curricular frameworks for literacy, numeracy and digital competency. These are mandatory elements of the new curriculum. And we also chose to include our child-friendly speak versions of the 4 purposes. These were created to enable our foundation phase age children to access the purposes. And so our teachers just highlight in yellow the statements which are explicitly being developed this half term for expressive arts. And finally, at the bottom in the orange arrow, teachers type in the learning process here and the sequence of activities. So you can see key terminology from the statements of what matters is used here, and we briefly map our forecasts for focus tasks, enhanced and continuous provision.
And thank you to St Asaph VP for agreeing to share their planning with us like that. Hopefully you found it useful to have that overview of how another school is planning, and we'll be looking at another example in a few minutes' time. Before the clip, I spoke about the use of big questions as a hook. And an example of a big question could be, if we moved to a new planet, what would we need to survive there? Now, some schools would prefer to use a big statement, such as, if we move to a new planet, we would not need to take plants and animals with us. and then pupils would then set about disproving the statement. But whether it's a question or a statement, the teachers have provided an initial hook to engage pupils' interest. Now, if we were to continue with this example of moving to another planet, once the hook has been decided upon, teachers could then decide upon the AOLE and statements of what matters that will be looked at in depth. The big question about moving to another planet naturally leads itself to science and technology AOLE. And in particular, the statement of what matters 3, which focuses on the world around us, is full of living things which depend on each other for survival. The school could highlight the intended key aspects of the statements of what matters that are to be focused upon during the topic. And this example here on this screen shows them highlighted in red. There is no expectation to cover all of the statements of what matters in a single unit of work. And when planning, teachers require prior knowledge of what pupils have already covered. This is to avoid duplication or to make sure that there is progression, and they need to ensure appropriate level of challenge. Now, in time, this information will come from records from previous statements of what matters records, and also progression steps records. But at the moment, they're not in place. So many schools now are providing their staff with opportunities to meet more regularly, to engage in that professional dialogue, to discuss pupils' learning and to discuss next steps. So the handover is more of a discussion. If we go to the next slide, this is simply to take this a little bit further. As well as looking at the statements of what matters, teachers will also refer to the progression steps. So, for example, it's important to understand the difference between progression step 2 and progression step 3. But this is on the understanding that progress from step 2 to step 3 can only be achieved through a range of deep learning experiences over an extended period. And on this slide, you can see that this topic is providing learning experiences to help pupils progress from step 2 to step 3. But it will be over an extended period, and it will be through those deep learning experiences. So the pupils will be moving from the ability to explore relationships between living things to being able to describe how living things compete. So on the PowerPoint, when you access this later, you'll be able to see that highlighted in blue, progression step 2 is I can explore relationships between living things, their habitats and their life cycles. And what we're aiming to do is move the children on to I can describe how living things compete for specific resources and depend on each other for survival. It is important to remember that pupils will not progress from one progression step to the next following a single unit of work. It happens gradually over time and following rich learning experiences. And this is what is meant when we say progression steps should not be used as a tick list. It's not a case of, right, they've done that now, park it, move on. It has to be revisited, and that learning needs to be deepened. And teachers also need to identify key teaching points as well. Those are the key concepts, the key skills and knowledge and the vocabulary that they need to teach during a unit of work. Regardless of where pupil voice may lead a topic, these would be the non-negotiables to be taught. So staying with this example, the teacher may identify the concept of food chains as a non-negotiable for this particular topic. Skills and knowledge should be revisited and applied during the topic, and that's to promote deeper understanding. So as the topic unfolds, pupils will be given opportunities to apply the work on food chains to support further learning. So it won't be a one-off session on food chains, it will be the use of that knowledge and those skills to support further learning. Many schools find that pupils don't necessarily raise lots of questions at the beginning, but they do tend to raise lots of questions as the topic unfolds. And one way of capturing these questions is by collating sub-questions or explorations to complement the initial hook, which was set at the beginning of the topic. So on the right-hand side of the screen here, there are examples of sub-questions raised by pupils that could lead to further inquiry-based learning and rich learning experiences during the topic. And the examples given are: what do humans need to survive? Would we need to take other plants and animals with us? There's a suggestion for an investigation about what do plants need to survive. What would be the best plants to take with us? Would we need to create new medicines, and so on? Now, if we take the second sub-question highlighted in red as an example, well, it should be highlighted in red, I've just checked it's there, but would we need to take other plants and animals with us? This could guide and reinforce the learning on food chains. So by the time we get to the next slide now, we've reached the point where, looking at this particular topic, there's a hook. The hook, which is the big question about moving to another planet. The teachers identified the AOLE, which is the Science and Technology AOLE. They've also identified and highlighted the aspects of the statements of what matters that they intend to focus on, which is statements of what matters 3. And they've reviewed and assessed prior learning through discussion with colleagues and looking at progression steps to make sure there's appropriate challenge. And they've also identified the skills and the knowledge that are non-negotiable during the topic. Those are the things that need to be taught and not left to chance, which is, in this case, food chains. Now, in addition to these elements that have been looked at so far, it's also important to keep all of the other elements in mind, but to plan for them when they are appropriate and fit in naturally. So planning should be purpose-led rather than looking for tenuous links or artificial links in order to tick off some of the other elements that have been covered. And the additional elements to be considered are the 12 pedagogical principles, which is deciding on the most appropriate teaching approaches, the relevance to the locality in a local context, pupil voice, integral skills, and so on. The list is on the left-hand side. Now, pupils' choice and preferences should be considered during the planning process, but there will be occasions when pupil voice may not be appropriate. If you're doing read, write, ink, or you're teaching specific maths lessons, pupil voice is not going to influence what's being delivered. Some schools invite pupil voice early on in the planning process with topics. Other schools prefer to identify the key knowledge and skills that they wish to develop and then invite pupil input. And a few schools have already adopted live in the moment planning, whereby the teacher is constantly responding to pupil input. An example of this is included in the exemplification clip from Broughton School, where pupil voice heavily influences planning. And this is available on the GWARE website so that you can see their planning process. The key message to schools is that meaningful, purposeful pupil participation should be a strong feature in the new curriculum. But nothing in the guidance suggests it should be completely pupil-led. It's up to the individual school to agree upon the level of influence of pupils on what and how they learn. That decision's up to you and how comfortable you feel with that. And teachers also need to integrate the cross-curricular and integral skills to be covered, weaving them into the planning. So that would be the creativity and innovation, the critical thinking and problem solving, personal effectiveness, and planning and organising. Now, some schools have found that these integral skills tend to happen more naturally. The cross-curricular skills should be carefully planned for, ideally where they naturally fit into the topic and where they're purposeful. And it's important for schools to build upon the recent rapid upskilling of people's digital competence and to integrate that into what you're doing during your topics. The Curriculum for Wales emphasises the importance of considering and planning learning experiences that are authentic and relevant to the locality. So, for example, if the school is situated near the coast, it would be appropriate to plan the work on food chains associated with the seashore. This could lead to deeper learning by using the locality and partners in the community to further research and explore, for example, the impact of wind farms or tourism or impact of agriculture on food chains along the coast. It's all about making it relevant to the locality. And when planning, teachers have found it useful to keep referring back to the learning intention, the initial hook throughout the topic, because this helps to apply the skills and the knowledge gained through the learning experiences. Ongoing assessment for learning can't be emphasised enough, because this enables teachers to fine-tune those learning experiences to ensure appropriate challenge, depth of learning, and then the application of those skills. For some pupils, and in certain schools, moving to another planet and doing this topic like this could appear to be oversimplifying the planning process, because in reality, the relationship and the connections between the various elements to consider when planning can be very sophisticated. Well, for a school starting out on the planning process, this approach could be a more straightforward approach to begin with. Then as teachers gain more experience of planning the curriculum for Wales, their expertise in weaving in all the elements will become more refined. Now, this example of food chains will be made available on the GWER website for you to refer to look at those steps that I just explained. It is important for teachers to ensure flexibility. Planning should be sufficiently flexible to allow the sessions to take a different direction from the initial planning in response to pupil choices or in response to unexpected news events and so on. And if we move on to the next slide, we're looking now at ensuring breadth and depth of learning as an essential consideration. And assessment and progression should be a key consideration all the way through the planning process. It's not simply about tracking coverage. Teaching something, parking it, and moving on to something else will lead to superficial learning. When planning, the emphasis should be on ensuring that the learning has depth. And then we've got that statement on the screen there. The statement saying that progression in learning is a process of increasing sophistication rather than covering a growing body of content. Understanding how learners progress is critical to learning and teaching and should inform curriculum design, classroom planning, and assessment. During the workshop on assessments, which was held last term, schools were reminded of the 5 principles of progression: increasing effectiveness, increasing breadth and depth of knowledge, deepening understanding of the ideas and the disciplines within the AOLEs, refinement and growing sophistication in the use and application of skills, and making connections and transferring learning into new contexts. So that's been covered in a previous unit, a previous workshop. But at the bottom of this slide, you'll find a link to guidance on enabling learning as well. And the enabling learning section for the Curriculum for Wales guidance has been developed to support schools with the design and planning for all pupils who are pre-progression step 1. Enabling learning comes before statements of what matters and the descriptions of learning at progression step 1. And the 3 enablers are the essential elements for holistic, meaningful learning: enabling adults, engaging experiences, and effective environments. Now, that would be a whole unit in itself to go through, and the GWER Foundation team will be providing sessions on enabling learning next week, looking at it in greater detail. Now, I'm sure you're ready for a change of voice now, so I'm going to hand you back to Kerry.
So this slide covers the importance of using evidence and expertise as part of the planning process. For many schools, they will be adopting an integrated approach to their planning, but there will be times where subjects are taught discretely, and you may benefit from disciplinary subject specific expertise. This may come from the local authority or from GWER. For example, many schools engage with the local authority Welsh support team, but it may also come from expertise that's within your cluster or communities. For example, some clusters have started working more closely with the modern foreign language departments in their high school, who are coming into the school to teach French and Spanish at their school. The pupils and the teachers benefit from that experience. Working with other settings, schools and further education also provides important opportunities to share learning and develop joined up experiences for learners across the learning journey. Collaboration across settings, across schools and in further education enables schools to develop a shared understanding of the curriculum as well as progression and assessment. It can aid transition, ensuring pupils make smooth progress across the 3 to 16 continuum and are well supported as they move between different classes, different year groups or settings. It also allows for that sharing of best practice. The guidance also promotes schools gaining understanding from high quality research and evidence. Teachers are encouraged to be innovative and take risks, and by using available evidence, this becomes calculated risks based on evidence-based research. A recent thematic report by Estin, Curriculum Innovation in Primary Schools, looked at the common features in schools where innovation has been effective. One common feature for those schools was that they saw the value of educational research. The National Strategy for Educational Research and Inquiry Vision document, which was published in 2021, also sets out the Welsh Government's ambition to develop an evidence-informed education profession within Wales, where leaders, teachers, support staff and other educational professionals use high-quality research to inform their practice and are provided with opportunities to take part in robust professional inquiry. Schools are being encouraged to be innovative and to explore new strategies for teaching and learning, and using high quality educational research and evidence or professional inquiry within their own schools will empower staff to make informed choices about why they're teaching, what they teach and how they teach. Finally, schools are being encouraged to take into account relevant information about learners and their communities, and this will form part of not just the whole school curriculum design, but also help to enable staff to make informed choices about what is important to and for their learners in your school and the communities that they live in, and how the planning can help to meet those needs. Many schools are already using evidence and expertise, maybe as part of their cluster working, as part of their work as a learning organisation, through working with ITE providers such as Caban. They may also be involved in projects such as the NPEP, the National Professional Inquiry Project, Ein Llais Ni, or through Lead Creative Schools. Some schools may have engaged in some small-scale research within their school or be conducting professional inquiry close to their practice. This will all help to ensure the schools are moving towards that ambition of being an evidence-informed education system. The link at the bottom of the screen will take you to the implementation and practical considerations section of the guidance, where there's more detailed reference to the use of evidence, research and expertise. Go to the next slide. Several schools have been kindly agreed to prepare and share clips that give an overview of their planning process. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to show all of the available clips during this session, but the links to these will be made available to you on the GWER website over the coming days. We're very aware of you that some of you may have already researched and introduced new planning processes at your schools and may be sitting there thinking, we already do this. We've got a great idea that we do this better. So if you are willing, please feel free to send us examples of the processes that your school has gone through so far. We can share those on the GWER Resource Centre as well for other schools to take a look. As we've said, there's no right or wrong way to plan. Schools need to do what is best for them and for their setting. But by seeing other ideas and the ways that other schools have approached things, it can sometimes help with sparking ideas. By sharing, we can all support each other as we navigate through the implementation. We're going to have a look now, though, at one more slide. And in this clip, we'll be showing the staff at Ysgol Pen y Fordd, who are explaining why they are teaching particular topics, their strategies for collecting pupil voice, and their use of assessment for learning. The school are also explaining the importance of co-construction, collaborative planning, and how staff have explored new teaching approaches to maximise pupil learning.
The question of why we are teaching this is very important for curriculum planning. At Ysgol Pen y Fordd, we have audited the 4 purposes for several years. It has helped to make important decisions about our school and the curriculum. Through this process, we have identified that we wanted to develop further the ethically informed citizen purpose. Listening to pupils is an essential element of curriculum planning. The slide shows some of the ways we are able to collect the views of our learners. Seesaw is an excellent tool which allows both parents and learners to share their views and to ask questions. Learners use Padlet as a collaborative platform to gather views both within and across classes. Imagineering and the discovery approach, and some of you may know it as Mantle of the Expert, which was introduced to the school by Howell Roberts, is a very rich way of engaging the children into projects which then have a real and authentic purpose. When planning the curriculum, we consider what is happening locally, nationally, and internationally. This year we have explored 2 themes. The first was refugees, as it was and continues to be an international priority, and the fact that we have 1.8% BAME learners whose experience of cultural diversity is limited. We felt that this learning area was a priority. The second was inspirational people. Again, we wanted to broaden the understanding of our children through this theme. We were lucky enough to know a local explorer who was going on an exploration to Antarctica with a team of other explorers and scientists. During a theme, assessment for learning is an ongoing element. This slide illustrates one aspect of this. It shows how we use assessment in writing from progression step 1 to progression step 3. The children populate the writing success criteria themselves, assess their work against this. They self-assess using purple pen, and they peer assess using red pen, and they're able to identify next steps. Being able to talk about how we learn best has been developed through the use of learning powers, and this is integrated into the curriculum planning. Collaborative planning amongst teachers has grown in our school, and as you can see, we now plan in teams and have a termly whole school theme.
So what elements do we need to consider when planning our curriculum? And what are our processes to address these? Planning is a lengthy process that often takes place and continues to form throughout a topic. Within our school, we've moved to whole school themes. This was partly due to the fact that we had a cross-phase class and it made it easier for us to plan. But it actually makes sense, and we can see the benefit of having the whole school using the same overarching theme. For example, we identified the topic of refugees for the autumn term, which began with foundation phase looking at the story of Paddington Bear. Throughout the school, progression was evident, and Key Stage 2 looked at other books such as The Boy at the Back of the Class and The Arrival. Before every topic begins, we're fortunate enough to carry out a book order based on these themes. We're also given a planning day, where teams come together to loosely map out the term. During this day, we look at Type 360 and we map out which of the 4 purposes are covered and the relevant what matter statements will be assessed. This forms a planning document, and we're finding this to be very useful for familiarisation of curriculum for Wales. The real planning begins once we've worked with children. We ask them what they would like to find out through a variety of methods. There are some non-negotiables within our topic, for example, the maths we'll be teaching, or if we know we need to carry out a science investigation, so we carefully manoeuvre this into our lessons. We actually type up an activity summary in retrospect, cataloguing the main tasks, and this is mainly for our own records. Throughout all of this, we look at cross-cutting themes: relationships and sexuality education, diversity, human rights, careers and work-related experience. And in all the topics, we try to relate everything we do on a local, a national and an international level. When deciding how to deliver activities and lessons, we draw on a range of approaches in order to provide the children with as many different learning experiences as possible, as we know that one size does not necessarily fit all. Within Ysgol Pen y Fordd, we use hooks. These can be at the start of or woven into a topic. Examples of these are finding a dinosaur's footprint on the school grounds, CCTV footage of a polar bear on our playground, a visit from a real-life Antarctic explorer, or trying to climb through laser beams that have appeared in the classroom during playtime. Our writing process has been developed over many years. Each new writing genre begins with a hook and then an immersion into high-quality reading texts. Engaging oracy and relevant writing skills development follows this. We'll often model the writing process to the children. After completing oracy at GWAY training, we've embedded a variety of communication practices across the whole of the curriculum. We have been fortunate to complete 3 years of Lead Creative Schools projects, which have given us an insight into how we can develop the curriculum more creatively. The pictures show how the topics have been brought to life in the most creative ways. The children have really taken ownership of the topics through this approach, from creating huge art pieces, performing dances, and hosting their own museum exhibitions. This pedagogical approach has really enlivened the teaching of our themes.
The Discovery approach is an immersive teaching approach which improves the botheredness of our learners. It's an approach to learning which supports children into being emotionally engaged with their theme. This results in rich learning. Outdoor learning forms a huge part of our curriculum. Within the foundation phase, it's accessed daily, but we also timetable every class throughout the school to have outdoor afternoons and days and forest school sessions. Numeracy and literacy sessions are enhanced outdoors, and we also have seen how the outdoors has had a positive impact on children's health and well-being. We have also recently introduced woodwork as a provision area in foundation phase, which has had a positive impact on problem-solving skills, creativity, oracy, and mathematical thinking. The display shows a celebration of work from the refugee theme. It also serves another purpose. It demonstrates the progression between progression step 1 and 3 and can be used for assessment.
Many thanks to all the staff at Ysgol Pennyforth for sharing that with us. But as you can see in just those 2 examples of what we've shown so far, it's clear that they've both got very different approaches. What's clear though in both of those is it's the process and how important that has been. Collaboration and developing that shared understanding is crucial, and allowing that time and space to undertake that work has been key. As we've said, all of this information is contained within the documentation available on Hub, but this slide just gathers together some of that key learning that has been identified from schools from across the GWAY region who've started to develop their planning. So planning should be lead towards that realisation of the 4 purposes. Schools should be looking for opportunities to plan those rich learning experiences that give that depth of learning and not just superficial coverage. And this is a real opportunity of the new curriculum. Schools need to facilitate that developing of a shared understanding and the purpose of planning. And collaboration and co-construction are essential, not just to develop that shared understanding across the broader context, but also to support learner progression, to draw on expertise, to celebrate successes, and to work together to solve challenges. Planning should be purpose-led and not activity-led, starting with the why. Have a clear rationale for why things are being taught. The guidance states that the system should challenge why certain activities are carried out or are required. If they don't contribute to learners realising our vision and aspirations, then are they necessary? Assessment and progression should be considered throughout the teaching and learning, and assessment should be reflective of the learner's needs. This will be an ongoing process. We need that consideration of the local context. Can partners in the community contribute? How do we integrate the Welsh dimension and make sure that we capture those unique features from our locality to bring the learning to life? Ensure that there's a balance between knowledge, skills, and experiences. Practitioners should support learners to engage with the descriptions of learning in increasing depth and sophistication over a period of time. All learners in Wales should be challenged, supported, and given opportunities to realise their full potential, and learning experiences should be inclusive and accessible. And those opportunities for pupil participation. Schools need to ensure that pupil involvement in the planning process, Participation is a key principle of the UNCRC, and enabling participation will create an engaging learning experience that responds to learners' needs, interests, and priorities. Following discussions, schools may decide that there may be differences in the planning format for certain curriculum areas. For example, in maths, there may be need to make reference to the 5 proficiencies, or in health and well-being, you may wish to include some elements of child development. These are the kind of things that you will need to discuss with staff at a local level to ensure that the planning meets the needs of the learners and the needs of the school and the requirements of the curriculum. Schools will also need to factor in a time to review and refine their planning, checking if the planning is broad and balanced so that it allows that breadth and depth. Monitoring will be required to check that the planning is coherent and sequential, allowing for progression over time, and that assessment findings and ongoing assessment should be used to inform the planning and changes in direction during units of work. By regularly reviewing planning during this time, you may refine and adapt your approaches, and for many schools, the planning will evolve. This next slide may seem a little bit odd because we said there's no right or wrong way to do things, but it says things to avoid. But we are noticing some common things that are coming back from schools when they are trialling these processes. So there are some possible pitfalls. Those pitfalls include things like making those tenuous links and connecting learning where they don't naturally fit together. We need to make sure that learning is authentic and purposeful. Repeating similar activities in different year groups without that clear progression. So that need to collaborate and check on prior learning and make sure that learning is sequential enables learners to make progress. Overcomplicating planning. Schools are finding that as they're going through this process, it needs to be kept purposeful, useful, and manageable. And avoiding creating systems which promote that superficial coverage without ensuring the depth. Progression in learning rather than coverage of content is at the heart of Curriculum for Wales. That fits in with the next one, which is about just avoiding placing assessment at the end of a planning process. Assessment plays a fundamental role in each individual learner to ensure that they're making progress at an appropriate pace and ensuring that they are supported and challenged accordingly on a day-to-day basis. When planning and delivering learning experiences, schools and practitioners should be clear about the specific role of assessment. Sticking with things that aren't working. This is going back to that point that we need to make that time to plan, do and review regularly as this is implemented. That will be really important to make that time and make sure that people have that opportunity to think about what is working, what isn't working, what do we need to change. So if we go on to the final slide, as we mentioned at the beginning, our aim today was to share some of the key principles and reflect on some of the key considerations that are coming through when planning. Just as we want schools to have that clear rationale for their curriculum, we aim to support them in developing that clear and agreed rationale for planning about the why, the what, and the how they teach as they work towards realising the vision in their schools. We realise there's been a lot of information today, but as Dave said earlier, everything that has been shared today will be made available over the next few days on the GWER website. If you would like to see examples of planning and the way schools have done this, there are some examples of planning that has been done by schools within the Curriculum for Wales, section on the GWER website under networks. Within some of the curriculum AOLE areas, there are some examples of planning in there. Support and improvement advisors will also be working alongside individual schools to discuss and further explore these should schools need it. This is a high-level overview of some of the principles, and later in the term, there will be some more guidance and workshops on areas such as specific AOLEs, mandatory elements, and as Dave mentioned, the enabling learning. And this will help to further help and develop the understanding in those areas. Pass you back to Dave.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, on behalf of Kerry and myself, I'd like to thank you for taking time out this afternoon from a busy day to join this session. We know you don't just rock up to these sessions without having to do an awful lot of planning to cover classes and so on. So we do appreciate that, and we hope you found it useful. We appreciate also you've got various duties to go back to, and therefore we don't want to keep you for any longer than necessary. So what we're going to do is, if anyone has a question or a comment, Terry and I are going to stay on now at the end. But obviously now you need to get back to wherever you have to get back to at school. But remember, you're welcome to discuss this session on planning with your Link SAAs back at school as well. So thank you very much, Diolch.